Alright, hello everyone, back with another video after a bit of a few months of absence, you know. Now, to a certain extent I don't really feel bad about an absence like that because I never promised to make even semi-frequent uploads. So, to a certain extent I don't care, but at the same time, you know, I want to upload when I can. I've really enjoyed doing this. The support has really been all I needed because, again, I have no aspirations or interest in becoming a full-time YouTuber or a massive YouTuber or a major institution in the community or any of that. Making money would be nice just because it would be useful, help out in my life and with my family and stuff, but it's not an urgent need and something that I urgently want. And like I said, to be a major YouTuber is not interesting and almost sounds bad, but at the same time, we'll see where this takes me. What I do appreciate though is the comments, because that's really what this is for me. Not only is this a fun outlet where I get to create things and just like talk about the game I like and obtain a use, create a use for the gratuitous amount of Overwatch League that just kicks around in my brain doing nothing, but also talk to people about it. And I really enjoy getting the comments. I got a lot of comments on my last video, which was awesome because it's just really fun to hear the things people add, things people have also noticed, the things people want to contribute, etc. It's really, really enjoyable. And last time I replied to basically all of the ones that I could reply to, that I could add anything to that were actually constructive and interesting, and they almost all were. I didn't get any flame. I got a little flame when I posted on Reddit, which I understand. Because I have an annoying affect when I talk that I'm trying to get over, but you know, it's just the way I am. And it was, you know, low production quality, which to a certain extent is just the way I'm doing it. I'm just going to rant. I'm going to have a loose script, but I'm not going to create a full exhaustive script, and I hope you can understand why. And you know, if you don't like it, you simply don't have to watch. But you know, and besides that, also, what else was I gonna say? Also, the last time I made it, I was kind of sick. This time I am not, which is nice. In fact, that's one of the reasons for the bit of the delay, is that when I had some free time to record around spring break, I came down with an ear infection, which made my nose kind of run in, whatever. Like, same problem, like, it would have been too phlegmatic, to borrow the terminology of the Four Humors theory of medicine. To be phlegmatic is also to be calm, apparently. An excess of phlegm makes you calm, the ancients thought, so that's cool. So maybe I'll be too wired because I returned to a normal amount of phlegm and do not have that sagely tranquility of demeanor. But we'll see. I don't think it's hard to get too excited when talking about the intricacies of competitive Overwatch metagame, and yet here I am. But all of that random crap aside, more importantly, the topic of today's video is weird tank duos, which is one, I guess it's a natural follow-up from my last video, which had a more unified thesis about the way role distinctions are going to trend and transform, but also was a nice excuse and a way to look at weird support duos as they have existed in various metas throughout the Overwatch League history, not to mention individual teams adaptations. So for this one, we're going to be looking at weird tank duos, which I already kind of brought up because I found a Winston Sigma VOD, and I got at least one comment, maybe a few more, that said they wanted to see it, so it seems like a natural next step. I have a few more ideas that have been kicking around that I would love to go into, but this is today's topic, and I think will be really great. Now, when I say weird tank duos, I need to define that, and the definition I will be using is one that I think will be pretty agreeable, however, is not scientific. It is simply a tank duo that, if you showed it to an experienced watcher or player of Tier 1 Overwatch, in Overwatch 1, post-roll-lock, they would say that's weird. You know, that's odd. That's an odd duo. And usually as a result of this, it will lack synergy in the traditional reckoning of what the two characters do put together. And they will often, but not always, be double main tank or double off tank, but not always. Winston Sigma, for example. And on that note of poor synergy, that's kind of where I'm going to be drawing the line, because there are some comps that sound pretty weird and sort of come off as weird superficially, but actually did see a lot of use. but at the end of the day, I'm going to be drawing the lines a little bit, you know, in my own reckoning and my own perception, and if some of you disagree, I completely understand. I won't be including Hog Sigma because I think it was too much of a relevant dominant meta at some point for me to include it. And there's plenty of other interesting metas from that playoffs patch anyway, so tough. Indeed, transitioning into the actual content, that will be our first one, is Hog Zarya. As I accidentally betrayed a minute ago. Now, if I say Hog Zarya, your mind will probably immediately jump to the Washington Justice, as it should. Other teams played this at least a bit. The London Spitfire, I have a nice Cleston Hog Bernard Zarya NFT. Not an actual NFT, if you know what that means, I'll get into it. Maybe I'll explain what that means, it's a joke. And also, more importantly, not more importantly, there's no hierarchy of importance here. The LA Gladiators also played that a little bit in their Losers Bracket series of the Florida Mayhem, which maybe I'll add some footage from. They started on the Winston 6-man comp that a lot of the NA teams were playing, and then when their back was to the wall and they realized that Hog was better, they switched to Space Hog Mirror Zarya, because you got Mirror on your team, you gotta use him for Pink Woman, and I don't blame them. Anyway, but the real team that kind of pioneered this comp, and the team that got the farthest with it, was the Washington Justice. As I go over each comp, I'll probably talk a bit about why the comp is bad, quote unquote, on paper, and why it worked anyway, basically. And use the gameplay that I'm showing you to kind of illustrate the ways it works and doesn't work, or works in spite of itself, etc. And to a certain extent, there's also often outside restrictions, namely hero pools. A lot of the weird comps we're going to be showing were only possible because of 2020 hero pools, though there were also a lot that aren't. There were a lot that were chosen even though other options are available. And I should know the hero bans broadly for the ones where that's the case, and I mean, the VOD can show me at the beginning of every map, so it'll be fine. Anyway, housekeeping aside, we start with the Washington Justice, who, as you might remember, forced this Hog Zarya comp exclusively throughout their entire playoff run. Now, before we even get into the gameplay circumstances that caused this comp to exist, this comp is actually a very interesting case because it was enabled a lot by roster construction restrictions, not anything in-game. Prior to playoffs, the 2020 Washington Justice was, like the Washington Justice was for its entire history. I think the Washington Justice, at least in terms of like who has the lowest peak in their entire existence in Overwatch League, I'm pretty sure the Washington Justice is arguably the losingest team in Overwatch League history. Not because they had the worst record or the least wins overall, though they're up there for that, to be sure, but because, like, if you want to measure every team's best achievement or highest placing, I'm pretty sure the Justice either have the lowest or the second lowest. A lot of teams won even a stage at some point. I think the real two competitors for, like, lowest meaningful peak are the Justice and the Defiant. And the Defiant have a few decent stage playoff performances that the Justice kind of lack. The question is if the Justice going medium far in the NA playoffs bracket counts, and I used to be a major revisionist actually saying that even the Justice's playoff run in 2020 was less impressive than people thought, but that was me looking at the play-ins bracket where they only beat shitter teams. In the playoffs, they admittedly beat the Valiant and the Mayhem, which is pretty impressive, so I'll give it up, right? Like, this is the 5th seed that they are about to smack around 3-1, though they lost first map, and we'll get into why. Anyway, returning to roster construction. One of the main reasons this comp worked at all for the Justice was not due to anything in-game, but because of roster construction. You see, the Justice were such a miserable team because, for a few reasons, but one of them is that their main tank was Roar, who was, frankly, an abysmal player throughout the season. It's easy to look bad on main tank, and many a player had their career ended because they were scapegoated by happening to be the main tank, but Roar really was a stinker. And there was even a widespread rumor that Roar never played the game outside of scrims and officials, that he didn't touch ranked at all. And not, as far as we can tell, because he thought it was bad practice, but because he just didn't care and was happy to get his paycheck. I can't 100%. In fact, people also said that he did spend his free time on video games, but he played Valorant, which came out midway through the 2020 season and was an occupation for many benched or recently released players. Now, whether Roar was on Valorant, I don't know, and we'll probably never know because of the language barrier. But I'm pretty sure I never saw him on Ranked as a spectator watching people stream Ranked, and I watched people stream a lot of Ranked in 2020, so I'm inclined to believe it's true. Regardless of his practice habits, though, Roar was an abysmal player, and so when the Justice signed Decay, they instantly took the opportunity to put Decay on Zarya, which Decay was very good at because he, like many of the hyper-carry DPS players of the time, was put on Zarya in GOATS, so Decay had Zarya experience. Still, Decay was a DPS player, and prior to the Justice, he was on the Dallas Fuel for most of 2020, where he was a DPS player and never touched off-tank, as far as I can remember. Decay was dropped by the Dallas Fuel pretty late in the season, as it turns out, because Decay, as you might know, has somewhat of an attitude problem, doesn't really like his teammates, especially his white teammates, and I support anti-white racism, to be clear, and was generally a tilter, probably didn't talk, and broadly a clubhouse cancer. Still, I think the Dallas Fuel held on to him for a while because, one, it's difficult to release any player, and two, Decay could carry absurdly hard when he felt like it, but I think the inting scrims and the general poor attitude eventually made them swallow their pride and get rid of him, even though he also delivered them some wonderful wins earlier in the year. Normally, being released so late into the season, I think Decay was probably released like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way into the season, would just mean you don't get on a team until next year. But 2020 had a unique signing rule that was put in because with COVID and everything, visa issues and mentality issues and stuff were plaguing a lot of teams, and some teams were losing the ability to field players that they otherwise were quote-unquote supposed to have. I think it was still only supposed to, you were only supposed to dip into signings this late in the season in some sort of like emergency, but you couldn't really prove, I guess, whether something was an emergency or not. So the Justice managed to sign Decay, sort of by bending the rules, sort of because a strange rule existed in the first place, very, very late into the season. So the Justice got an infusion of one of the best players in the world mere moments before playoffs, which, you know, certainly helps you go on a playoff run. But again, a double off-tank meta coming into existence was also quite convenient for them, because now they don't have to even field Roar at all. Janu and Stitch were also relatively late acquisitions for the Justice, only being on the free market after the runaway era Vancouver Titans collapsed due to the Vancouver Titans' mismanagement of their superstar roster by giving them no support staff and leaving them more or less stranded in a concrete apartment in the middle of Canada, which caused the players to demand their return to APAC after COVID started to get worse to ensure that they weren't stranded in Canada during a global pandemic, and the complete disgust and mass exodus of every Korean player on the Titans, with them even considering, if the rumors are true, a strike, which is absolutely unheard of in esports. Esports players are not a class-conscious workforce. They don't even have an in-person, like, factory. I mean, they're esports players. They don't have a shop floor. They have a team house, and they didn't even have those in 2020 and 2021. At least not in every case. So, the fact that the Titans still were close to a strike tells you all you need to know. But when the Titans exploded, the Justice managed to swing Stitch and Janu, which were also massive signings to help them with this team incredibly. Janu was far better than the Justice's old off-tank, Sansam, though Sansam had a Roadhog on him, so in this particular meta, Sansam might have been workable. But Janu hit better hooks anyway. And then Stitch was a incredible hit scan who actually was lights out for the entire playoffs. If we want to look past the signing of Decay, and we can't, but if we must, Stitch was absolutely a freak in these playoffs. And if we get to Volskaya, which I think we might, then you'll see him just tear up the lobby. So this comp was very convenient for Justice because it filled a roster gap where they could finally bench their main tank who sucked, get Stitch on a carry roll with a Perpetual Mercy pocket, and Janu could hit enough hooks to make it work. And this kind of leads into the benefits of the Justice's comp. To be sure, Hog Zarya is mostly a terrible tank duo. In fact, one of the main problems with this playoffs patch that allowed the Justice to go so far is that so many teams' read on the meta was this Winston, Diva, Lucio, Moira, Sombra 6-man comp. I could probably put some footage in for that right now, but why this was their read, I'm not 100% sure. Part of it is that although Hog was buffed right before the playoffs, Hog, then as now, because he still has this, has a reputation of just being a fundamentally flawed character who will never be good in a pro environment. And so when Hog becomes meta, or when Hog becomes buffed, especially back then after he'd been... What? How did they not see... How did they not see Shax? Wait, how did they... Okay, how did they not see Shax, and then how does he lose that anyway? Ark looked like he didn't... Ark looked like he assumed it was Tuba or something. They probably... I think they might have assumed it was Tuba. How the hell did Ark just not see the red outline? I don't know. Okay, that's something. Anyway, sorry, distracted by an insane play there. So when Hog was buffed, a lot of... at least pros still doubted that Hog would have any relevance, at least in an organized environment. He was destroying the ranked ladder, but even when Hog is broken in ranked, a lot of times there's immense suspicion towards him actually being good at the pro environment, because Hog just kind of loses to coordination, basically. If you're good at tracking cooldowns, if you're disciplined about playing cover, if you can attack him as a target in some sort of comp, then he really does just kind of fall over. In fact, I'll show you the Unco tweet. Dallas Fuel Unco retired part was, I think he was still getting paid for a lot of 2020, but he had retired because whatever, he was like perma bench, and they found better flex support and in Crimzo, and he was washed. And like a lot of the benched and or released players in 2020, he moved to Valorant. But after playing Valorant for a while, he went back to Overwatch, and he made some furious tweet about how, wow, you guys all suck. I know that he's buffed, but why are you picking Roadhog anyway? He said, the best thing he said, which became a meme because of course it did, it's incredible. He said, even if Roadhog could fly, he wouldn't be meta, which is really funny and kinda real. So, I think one of the reasons this Moira Lucio 6-man comp was meta is because, even with Hog buffs, I imagine a lot of teams were just reflexively suspicious that Hog would actually be good. And two, even if Hog was the theoretical best hero, I think some teams probably just couldn't play him because off-tank wasn't expected to play Hog very much in the past few years, so a lot of people just weren't good at him. And Hog might be easy in the sense that all you have to do is hit hooks, but that's still a mechanically challenging thing, especially at this level of play. It's like Widow. Like, Widow is easy to improve on insofar as all you need to get good at is mechanics, but those mechanics are hard as hell, so, you know, if you can't do them, you can't do them. Also, the other thing was, in complete theory, the Winston 6-man comp didn't even have a bad matchup into Hog, because Hog was a great target for it. You could hack him as Sombra and then just run on him. And if the comp played, you know, was careful enough about their cooldowns, was disciplined with their positioning, and just made sure not to, you know, move outside of cover until everyone was ready to go and the engage was right, you kind of couldn't do anything against this Hog. You still could. In fact, we'll probably put on Justice versus Mayhem or something, but it wasn't a freebie by any means. It wasn't a free loss by any means for the Hog comp, but also like you could see why it would work, and you really could just hack the Hog and then run him down if you played properly, and especially if you could bait out a cooldown or something. So you could see the vision there, as it were. Anyway, as far as this idea of new signings goes, another advantage of the Justice's comp is that even though it's... so, as I mentioned, the Justice's comp is terrible on paper because... First of all, because there's even questions about whether Hog was meta, but he kind of was. I mean, his one-shot was so good, but it's still kind of bad because really Hog needs something more than his Zarya. Hog Orisa was an old classic for various reasons. Not only does it just have incredible synergy with Pull Hook, allowing you to one-shot people even as they're behind cover, but also, you know, Hog really likes a massive durable shield to hide behind, because he is a squishy target, and he is so susceptible to the utility from Zen and Ana, as anyone who's played Overwatch 2 will know, that he really does appreciate a massive shield to hide behind. And in general, Hog comps, because of how squishy their tank is, and because their tank doesn't really allow a coordinated rush or dive, he just kind of finds people and hooks them. Hog comps have to be pokey, they have to be long range. There is no Hog rush, not in 222 anyway. pre-roll lock, you can have triple tank with a hog in it or whatever, but like in a meta like this, you can't run a hog has to be played in poke, and so that seems kind of counterintuitive to the Zarya, and indeed Hog Sigma ended up being the actual comp. So it's kind of weak because like you want like a really long range comp that just plays angles and is spread out, but then you have a Zarya instead of a Sigma who can actually do mid to long range damage and like provide a shield for people, so it's just weird. It's also just low on utility. You don't even have, again, you know, the shielding or eating of a Sigma or the incredible matrix of a diva. You have no ability to contest high ground. You just have bubbles and the raw damage Zarya provides. However, she provides raw damage. And another advantage of this comp, and still another advantage of this comp, is that especially with Zarya, Hog is completely self-sufficient. Hog is already basically self-sufficient. Zarya enables this even more, because the way the Justice plays this, as you can see, is that Decay Janu is this two-man strike team. They just waddle around the map, and whenever Janu peeks out from cover, Decay bubbles him. It's still a weird comp, because Decay kind of can't get healing a lot of the time, because Arc just has to play back with Stitch, and probably Aim God too, unless Aim God takes a different angle and just damage boost them and, you know, res them if they get picked, which is useful, but the Zarya sometimes just can't get healing. A lot of times Decay is basically taking perma damage, or the only healing he's getting is the regen of shield health. So Decay is like playing like an Overwatch Nuzlocke where all damage is permanent. But it still has a few advantages. First of all, it's still a poke comp even if Zarya doesn't fit. So it allows a Zen player and an Ashe player to just kind of show off their mechanics and just focus on playing cover and just playing Kovacs, basically. They can just kind of sit in the back and click heads, or sit on high ground near cover somewhere and just click heads. And damn if Stitch can't do that. And even though Aim God is questionable flex support pickup at best, though he was better at this time than he would be later in his career. A lot of, I would say any solid flex support can play Cookie Clicker as Zen, even if they're weak in, you know, some of the more team play-ish elements. So it really kind of distills the game down to mechanics. And finally, even though Zarya is bad on papers, Decay is an incredible Zarya player, and it allows him to also just kind of point and click. He can just use his incredible tracking and his basic skill of cooldown management, and naturally there's a certain amount of synergy between Zarya and Hog in the way there is between, you know, Hog and Kiriko in Overwatch 2, where you just get to cleanse the various effects that Hog will sponge over the course of a game. One of the main things they do is, and you'll see it here, they peek to get a hook, and Decay bubbles the peek, so that, and the fact that Janu gets it, and Decay bubbles the peek. It's also even has an advantage in terms of this like 6-man meta that NA was playing, because Sigma gets run over by like a real kind of rush. Like if a rush can get close to Sigma without making a poke, it'll just run him over. But like if you do a rush like this, Zarya is way better. Like Zarya is going to be perma high energy and can melt the diva and even melt the Winston if she gets a little help with breaking bubble. Like you kind of see the vision here. But it's a fringe comp and it wasn't really used much outside of the Justice, though the Justice made it work. But it's pretty beautiful. It was a really interesting comp. It's really fun to watch, and it just allowed Decay to play to his strengths and really show off his famous carry potential. You see, the Justice have done the same rollout every fight, which is the Hog and Zarya go to that corner and kind of recuperate and get ready to go, and then they peek probably with a bubble. And Janu just gets a hook. You see, Decay takes Decay is playing a Nuzlocke. The damage is permanent. It's a massive grab, and this is just going to be it. They just push it in here. I've seen this VOD a few times in prepping for this video, so they push it in here. But as you just see, it's incredible. And the other nice thing about this comp is even if the early fight is just like bizarre and kind of makes no sense in a theoretical level, once they actually get to the point successfully, then they're just unstoppable. Like if you want to beat this comp, you have to do it in like the first half of the game. You can't, once they get to point in one piece, you've already lost. And that's kind of why the Valiant ended up going this Zen Mercy variant, which worked. The Zen Mercy variant that they ended up doing actually won them map 1. And you see why. You kind of can't beat this comp with a 6-man Mori Lucio rush, or if you do, you have to be incredibly disciplined. But the Zen Mercy allows you to just kind of match that long range poke, and maybe you just, you know, snipe them and win. You know, you match their Zen Mercy Ash thing, and then hell, you know, KSB gets a few headshots and he's known to do that, and then you're doing just fine. Alright, so for our second duo, we're going to be going into Winston Ball. Now, Ball Winston is unlike Zarya Hog, where it's truly sort of unfixably flawed. Rather, this comp is weak, but only really because it's outclassed in normal circumstances. Normally, Winston and Ball would both just rather have an off-tank. However, this patch that this match was played on between the Titans and the Charge, not patch, but rather at this period in OWL, this week, I think, because I think the pure bans might have even differed week to week or on a 2-week basis. In this particular instance, D.Va was banned, so if a team wanted to play Winston Dive, you would have to have a Ball instead, unless you wanted to play Winston Sigma, which we would actually end up seeing quite a bit of in 2020, but that was not the Titans' comp choice. In fact, with the Brig Zen, which is itself interesting and kind of funny, you can even say that what the Titans really have is a Ball comp with Winston rather than a Winston comp with Ball, if that makes sense. I think you guys can pick up what I mean. Where it's the Ball is like the real kind of main tank. Though I will say, in terms of the way the comp actually plays, the Winston is more of the main tank. So traditionally, the reason this comp doesn't work, or isn't seen rather, is simply because Winston would rather have a Zarya or a D.Va, and Ball would likewise rather have a Zarya, D.Va, or a Sigma. I would guess that there are a few reasons to this. First of all, Winston Ball is kind of low damage, basically. Ball does a lot of damage with Slam, but that's it. Like, you need to slam them. And so Ball's uptime is just kind of low, and the comp really needs very precise timing to kind of get things done. Compare this to the very, very consistent, reliable damage of D.Va's shotguns, not to mention her missiles, which can back up further, or in particular Zarya, who has very consistent damage as long as she can bubble Winston, and it's not hard to bubble Winston and get some energy off him on a dive. Moreover, off-tanks are nice because they allow more consistency, basically, because Matrix in particular just allows you to absorb so much BS, for lack of a better term. Ana Nade is so strong, Ana Sleep is so strong, so many cooldowns, or at the very least, even if D.Va isn't absorbing a specific cooldown, she's buying you valuable time, you know. Discord is going to get closer to expiring because she can Matrix you for a few seconds, etc. These tanks don't have any way to protect each other outside of Bubble, and Bubble doesn't really protect the ball in any meaningful sense. You'll stink you'll hear from Janu, by the way. I was talking to a friend of mine who was/is a diehard Vancouver Titans fan. She was telling me that when she watched this game, she knew it was over, that they were going to mental boom and all retire. Not that you can blame them. I believe this was actually their first game in APAC because, as I mentioned in the Hog section, this roster started 2020 in Vancouver itself, and stranded there by an uncaring org with no translator or support staff, basically. And then, not only was this a pretty untenable state of affairs on its own, but then COVID broke out, so the Titans roster demanded to be allowed to go home to Korea and thereby switch from NA to APAC, and how can you... I mean, it was either that or they quit, and they quit anyway, so can't exactly blame them. I'm glad they forced their management's hand, to be quite honest. I support laborers in any agitation against capital, so good for them. Would have been nice to see Titans actually carry out the strike they allegedly threatened, but I digress. By the way, sorry, I'm so sidetracked there that I missed. This comp, Summon-Su single-handedly backpacks this fight. It's incredible. Guangzhou should have this submap already tied up, and tied up as in wrapped up, like finished, and Summon-Su just comes out and whips it out, frankly, and demolishes like 3 of them. What's even crazier here, right, is that normally in the roll lock era, you would have to see Doomfist with like a lot of help, or else he'd be so squishy that he'd just fall over. Normally he'd be in a rush comp with a Reinhardt to hide behind, and maybe even a Zarya to bubble him as well, or in double shield with an Orisa to pull punch targets for him. To see him just freewheeling with no help in the big 2020 is kind of wild on its own, and the fact that someone who does all this work without a massive tank to stand behind like half the time is very impressive. Anyway, so while this combo is fundamentally flawed, it still has a certain logic that it follows. The basic way it works, I would say, is that the Winston is more so the main tank, because usually what happens is the Winston is the one who's diving a long distance to get to a target. The Ball is normally playing an off angle, kind of on his own, as the Ball tends to do. In general, really, Ball plays the role that Ball is often said to play sometimes, of Fat Tracer. That's kind of a joking phrase people use to describe Ball sometimes, and it's really quite accurate a lot of the time, especially in this comp. Because Ball users are going to be kind of playing on an off angle to get some pressure going, or what's going to happen is, instead of swinging in from the same location as the Winston, the Ball is going to get set up lurking on some corner or something, and then the Ball is going to give the word go for his slam, and then the Winston comes in closer to the core of the team. The Winston kind of plays on the core, gets ready to dive, and then dives, whereas the Ball gets in position and then lies in wait to give the command, and then the Ball just slams from nearby. Not always. Sometimes the Ball and Winston jump from the same position, like one would assume, but it's not the first option, and kind of a convenient mode that they use when they have to, or when they think they can get away with it. Like, for example, if it's overtime and they don't have time to get the Ball set up. That is another, I'd say, fundamental problem with this comp, actually, is that you simply are just kind of low on uptime. And again, that's what happens when you don't have an off tank to kind of help your Winston either get in position or stay in. You just have to do these very, very brief coordinated engages where you just have to kill someone with a flash in the pan, which can work, but it's not a freebie. Another weakness this comp that Guangzhou exposes is that if you're not afraid to counterpick, even the double shield that a lot of teams played on this patch, you could just go hog and then hell, maybe throw a brig in there, and then you're kind of cooked. And Guangzhou did just that. And you have to give credit to Guangzhou as well, right? Because a lot of teams at this time, I think, did not counterpick so freely in officials. I think at this time, the culture around compositions was much more that you would stick to what you scrimmed and you wouldn't really freestyle into something you weren't experienced with, or you wouldn't unless you absolutely had to. Whereas I'd be pretty confident Guangzhou never scrimmed Moira, Brig, Orisa, Hog, and yet they just go to it because they know they can swap the Sigma for Hog and swap the Lucio for Brig, and then it just becomes so much easier. Or really maybe like swap the Bap for Moira, arguably, because Brig already has a place in Double Shield as well if she so chooses. And again, you see the lurking, right? This is a textbook example of the thing I was talking about. The Ball gives the word go, the Doom gives the word go, and then the Winston comes in from far away. There's the lurkers, and then there's the guy who sits on the core and goes when he's ready, and the latter camp is the Winston. And you see that this comp at least sort of ticks, you know, it's a demanding, hard, kind of weird dive. And also, because Ball is so low resource, you can get away with Zen as well, though I imagine Ana was banned, but they'll have to check. And so it also plays a lot like a poke comp, really, and I guess that's another way they kind of justify the low uptime, is that in theory you can get a lot of value just by Zen doing his stuff. Results were not amazing this time, I think also when you just have a shield and so much healing, and a Tracer to make the Zen fear for his life at all times. That doesn't actually work as well as one would think. But again, credit where it's due to Guangzhou. I think the idea that you have to counterpick mid-match is much more well understood today. I remember hearing Christopher talking about how on map 1, if the comp you practiced all week doesn't work, who cares that you practiced it all week? If it's doing that badly, you just have to try something else. Or I remember in the last season of Owl, there was a regular season game near the end of the season where the San Francisco Shock played this like Junker Queen, I think TP rush, like Junker Queen Sim rush thing against Atlanta, the Atlanta Rein. And Atlanta had no idea how to beat it, or they couldn't beat it with their regular stuff, so they just mirrored it and won. And I remember Gator said something after the match to the effect of, like, if you can't beat their comp and nothing is working, just mirror it. And you can see the appeal of that, because you basically turn it into a sort of rough, uneven comp matchup, where, you know, every character kind of has like a different job, and you're thrown on the back foot on something you don't know, into basically just can all 5 rolls out mechanically, all 5 rolls on the other side.
And when the actual sort of asymmetrical matchup doesn't work, I mean, that's a pretty good gambit to try, and it works a decent amount of the time. Again, we see Chanu as the lurker, Winston jumps in from far away together, and the Doom lurks with him too, so that is the split that they play. So this is a pretty cool comp in that sense. And it's just so interesting to see because we never think of Winston Ball as being a thing, and for good reason. It is nominally functional, but it's just so much more demanding and rickety than the firm, reliable Winston Diva or Winston Zarya. And this end of the map, more like next fight than this fight because they're only 80%. Next fight is an absolute dogfight. I'm going to skip a little bit because we already watched so much of this. Actually, wait, we already see it here. See, Rio makes a microscopic mistake. He uses Bongo a little early as like kind of like a celebratory thing or like a we've already run the round type thing. And Vancouver makes them almost pay for it. Absolute heroics from Fissure, by the way. You want to see Fissure at the height of his powers. Managing to kill 2 in that situation is absolutely insane, but that's Fissure for you. Somehow, though, it isn't enough. I mean, the other thing, again, about the Vancouver Titans comp is that they can't, like, stay in and die forever. They have to get out. They have to get health packs. Or, like, they have to basically do everything in an incredibly brief amount of time. It has to be one burst where everything happens at once. And if that spike, so to speak, doesn't just outright win the fight, then in the long run, almost any other comp is probably going to win out, and that's exactly what you see here, is gradually Guangzhou, even like kind of losing the pick war a lot, just gradually wins it out, because Vancouver's comp just did not have the throughput for a long-term team fight. They just have to run away and get help so much. On map 2, they do a double shield mirror Eichenwald, so we'll gloss over that real quick. Actually, never mind. Instead of going to map 3 I have another case of Winston Ball and Bolskaya Industries that's interesting in its own way, and that will be Chengdu versus Vancouver. And so this comp is even crazier than whatever Vancouver ran, because this is like 6-man basically, but instead of Reaper Sombra, it's double projectiles, Genji Doom, because whatever, Jinmu is Jinmu and Leave is Leave, and it's Winston Ball. And what's even funnier, what's even more awesome is it's Moira Lucio, but it isn't run like 6-man. They still play split, even though their supports are Mercy Lucio, because it's Chengdu, I guess, and they just don't follow any appreciable rules of the game that we've come to expect. And so they make a 6-man comp, but it's Winston Ball, and also we're not actually playing it Winston Ball, but Elsa Winston is a wonderful NFT here that you can add to your collection if you are, like me, an enthusiast of OWL players on uncharacteristic, let's say, heroes. Vancouver's strategy is something you'd expect much more for this situation. Diva banned, but the Rein Rush stuff was still really strong in this period of the game's life, this early 2020 build. So you just do this, and you just kind of hole up in the building so that people can't, so that dive comms, which prefer the much more open space, can't use all of that space to hit you from multiple angles. You just are this giant bunker that, again, if anyone gets too close, they just get mowed down. Yeah, Chengdu's just playing split for some reason. Like, Jinmu's off on his own. Leave is doing God knows what. Among's behind them, but also he gets out. Amazing stuff. The goal behind Chengdu's comp is more intelligible. Well, no, it's not. I lied. The Vancouver comp we saw on Nepal makes sense, at least in that, like, okay, well, Diva's banned, so I understand, and, like, I suppose, you know, with the Zen Brig, you can still just kind of win off poke, and you can sync the cooldowns, but Chengdu's makes even less sense. Like, you're 6-man, but you have, like, a Genji, so your DPS aren't really self-sufficient enough on their own to kind of farm the tanks or whatever. Like, you don't have lifesteal, and then you're not even playing it in a big ball. Like, you're playing it all spread out. And then this is a comp that at least should rush a team down close range, but then you have Wrecking Ball, who will either do nothing in an up-close rush or actively boop them away. Elsa primal mechanics are certainly a sight to behold. I wish we got first person, but beggars can't be choosers. Leave does a wonderful get quaked on ceiling meteor strike, and then it doesn't even work. Fantastic. Skip a little bit. But yeah, this one, I've already articulated kind of why this comp is interesting. Now we're really just in for a complete, just unhinged insanity. And this was a wonderful side effect of hero pools. Hero pools should not have existed. They weren't really chosen in a good way, you know, cats, etc. For the uninitiated. The Owl hosts and production came up with various novel ways to choose the hero pool for the week, and one of them was that Zoe's cat picked from a selection of heroes and they were banned for the week. Yes, really. And beyond that, it was also a difficult endeavor because banning them in ranked sounded promising, but then people didn't really like having their characters deprived of them, and also the time spans of the owl bans versus the ranked bans were kind of different, because you can't make a ranked ban too long because people don't want to be deprived of their character for that long. But then in owl, you don't want the bans to be too short, because if the meta is changing so much, it becomes an absurd amount of work for the coaches. Even with relatively longer hero pools, I remember hearing about coaches just being worked to the bone trying to come up with stuff, because also I think the approach to coaching back then, especially on a lot of teams, was less player innovation and free will and more like, I am going to dictate to you the exact comps and starting positions you are going to use on every map. I think, but I could be mistaken. I imagine coaching styles also changed, not even because of philosophy per se, but rather just less resources. You know, now you don't have enough money to have 2 assistant coaches, you know. So there's no delegation of responsibilities. In any case, Winston Ball was almost never seen outside of hero pools because it was just, there were just better options. And even in hero pools, there were better options that I think teams just didn't feel like playing or wanted to try or had a crackpot idea. I still think when you look back, especially Chengdu's comp here, you really should just be doing Winston Zarya. I suppose they're that unconfident in the aim on Winston, but someone should tell them about Zarya Ball, because later in this season, Chengdu will discover that, and it will reverse their fortunes as a team. So this one, very weak, very strange, fundamentally flawed arguably, but just so absurd that it leads to some excellent viewing. So I'm glad I could talk about Winston Ball here. Turning to double main tank plus Wrecking Ball, and in particular the Chengdu Hunters, who loved Ball more than anyone else. Our next unusual tank comp is Orisa Ball. Not unlike our previous discussion of Winston Ball, this comp is not fundamentally kind of lacking something crucial or fundamentally incapable of achieving some sort of game plan in the traditional sense, but is simply just a comp that's normally outclassed. In terms of playing Wrecking Ball in a more pokey comp, which is fine on its own, because Ball is so self-sufficient that you don't need to do the 3-2-1 dive that we imagine in our heads when we think of dive comp. But when you are using Ball and poke, by the way, leave absolutely disgusting on that one. People forget about the leave Echo now that Echo has firmly moved into the flex DPS side of the Division of Labor. But Leave's Echo was lights out, and one of the main reasons he got MVP in 2020, because the character was new and thereby good in 2020. This VOD is from 2021, but recent enough that Leave's Echo was still an absolute demon. Anyway, like I said, normally Ball was paired with Sigma. Ball is fine in a poke comp, but it would normally be Sigma for a few reasons. First of all, having a stun and having an eat are still quite nice utility, though Sigma isn't exactly constantly eating ults in Ball Sig. One of the biggest reasons, to be honest, I would say, is that Sigma's shield was way more flexible because, first of all, deploying it wasn't a matter of throwing a projectile, it was just you could materialize out of thin air whenever you wanted to. and it can be repositioned really flexibly. Originally, Sig could remove and replace his shield with no cooldown, and then eventually they made it, I believe, the 1.5 seconds that it is today. It might be 2 seconds today. I think they've tweaked that a little bit at various times. Overall, though, Sig offered a certain flexibility that Orisa lacked. Moreover, he was even kind of squishy in a sense. It feels silly to call Orisa squishy, and she mostly isn't because, I mean, come on, this is the character that has Fortify, but once you get close to Orisa, I think her effectiveness tapers off in a way that Sigma doesn't. Because, like, Sigma's left click is still pretty good at close range. Again, better at mid-range, but fine at close range. Whereas Orisa's becomes really weak, that sort of thing. So mostly Sigma was preferred. Moreover, if you were doing a poke composition with Orisa as the non-negotiable starting point, you would still rather have Orisa Diva or Orisa Sigma, depending on the team. And maybe Orisa Hog on the various periods where Hog is viable and or as a counter call. So these two characters are kind of disjointed, but they're still okay together. The reason Chengdu played this, well, I'm not exactly sure why. But my idea is, first of all, Chengdu liked to use this on full holds, or when they had to try and full hold, like deny even a tick. That's not the case here, though I think also in general, maps where forcing point is really important, like where the place the defenders want to hold is really far from the point, and where just sending a tracer to point causes so much, causes the complete degeneration of the positions you want to take. Ball, I think they liked because Ball, as we know, is one of the best characters at just contesting a point and sitting on it in the game, even in a way that Diva isn't. So mobile, so much shielding, and so on. And so, especially when they had to defend a point for like one tick or something, they liked Ball because he could just deny the cap without the entire combo uprooting itself. Another thing that we see here is that although Gravitic Flux is pretty good, Bongo is an absolutely insane ultimate. I mean, a group damage boost is so good in a hero shooter, and so that was a really nice thing that this comp allowed, where it gives a nice ult cycle, because if you do, by sheer luck or mechanical greatness, win a few fights, now you have the best ult in the game just sitting in your arsenal, and that ult synergizes with every composition, so you can't really go wrong with Bongo if you can manage to charge it. Also, Orisa does in fact have more raw poke at a longer range than Sigma. Sigma can only poke at mid-range. Orisa can poke from very, very far away, as well as mid-range. So, if you really want to, again, do a strong long-term defense, like hold a point, Orisa is nice in a way that Sigma isn't for that. Still, as I mentioned, Sigma's overall flexibility was better. But we can see that Chengdu, oddballs and ball lovers that they were able to try it anyway, and it worked pretty well. Jimmy is absolutely chilling. He had one hand on the keyboard. He is laid back. He's having a grand old time. Also, some good Evil Toaster action from Elsa. Now let me show you the comp again. And now we're going to look at the comp again, but in one of those full holds that I talked about. This one's even funnier, one, because it's late young Orisa, and two, because the comp surrounding is even weirder. But again, Chengdu understands that forcing point completely topples their entire defense, so they need something that can hold point forever, and Ball provides that. It also plays quite well into A1's strong suit. And although Philly eventually capped this, credit where it's due, it holds for a pretty long time. Again, the Orisa is, again, you see that Orisa's kind of squishy, and so she has to play like really far back, or either Evil Toaster or semi-Evil Toaster. And again, you can see the vision why the hell you do this when Among's already about to get mines. And Leave already charged Bob, though that's much more expected with Mercy Ash, especially if Damage Boost and Dynamite still work the way I think it does. Well, I don't really know if that was actually like a glitch. That's not really a glitch, it's just Damage Boost and Dynamite is a good ass way to charge your ult. We're also looking at just Overwatch 1 ult charge times in general, but again, like, Chengdu understands that if you want to hold for a really long time, one, adding good point presence to your comp, and two, creating a really deadly ult cycle is nice. And that's the other thing, is that you have things like Valk. Like almost all of these ults can single-handedly win a fight except for Trans, and Trans is just nice to have anyway. Trans can single-handedly deal with an enemy ult because, maybe if you, for example, a lot of times when teams would try to break, only had to get one tick, they would just go Genji, Ana, Winston, and they would just charge a nano blade, something like that. So Trans is about your best shot at dealing with that. And look at that ult cycle. And that's the other thing, is that Ball Sombra honestly makes even more sense than what Chengdu is running on Anubis, because Ball Sombra is almost a two-man dive all its own. You almost don't need anything else. You just slam into the EMP and you're doing just fine. Fusion eventually pushed it in, of course, but Chengdu's game plan more or less works perfectly. Like, they successfully get an insane ult cycle at all times. But Fusion managed to eventually bank their own stuff and play a really disciplined, thorough rotation game where they can just rotate and recuperate the resources. And insane pull from Mono, by the way. Nice Icicle to finish the job, just a little bit. If Chengdu complete that rotation, they might still hold, but Papa waves goodbye to leave, and it is curtains, for credit where it's due. Still, Ball Orisa was very limited, as Sigma really did outclass it in the ball poke department, and in terms of the full poke department, so did Double Shield or Orisa Diva, but the comp still had some legs, even if Chengdu specifically was basically the only team who used it, and it's worth talking about because it just looks so funny. And it often ends up with an off-tank playing the Orisa that they're not used to playing, so grand old time there. So our next weird tank duo is Winston Sigma. Now this one is interesting because most of the tank duos that gloss as sufficiently weird that I've covered so far are either double main tank or double off tank. They're so weird that they don't even fit into the division of labor traditionally expected of the main tank and off tank role. However, this one is a bit of a funny one because it is main tank off tank, but seems incredibly strange anyway. For obvious reasons, really. Sigma is the poke tank, using double shield, known for his strong mid-range damage, providing a durable shield, whatever. And Winston is the dive tank, and we've learned by now that diving doesn't just have to be 3-2-1ing a target from long range along with your other tank and a DPS, that you can play Winston. I mean, this is the way he's played a lot in Overwatch too, either basically as a rush hero or even just a less committal style that focuses on enabling DPS, getting out cooldowns, doing big cleave and farming primal, farming nano for your Ana, etc, etc. Still, this off-tank main tank combo seems quite strange. However, it was surprisingly common for a pretty decent period in summer 2020, to the point that you could make an argument, though I really think this comp is forgotten and funny looking enough to earn a spot in this video, that doesn't even count as a weird tank duo, but I won't really be humoring that. Anyway, although this tank duo wasn't seen a lot, it was played, and it was, as you might imagine, enabled by hero bans. What's strange, though, is that it was not the removal of Diva that enabled this, which is probably the first thing that might come to mind. Like, oh, Winston and Diva are best friends, and if, you'd only use Sigma in the situation over Diva if Diva doesn't exist. But if you look at the history of when this was played, and you look at the beginning of the map and any of the VODs I show you, the hero that was banned that enabled this is actually Orisa, which is not what you might expect. And this actually introduces a really interesting, again, another kind of revisionist narrative, or different way to interpret the recent past in Overwatch history, meta history. A lot of people pin the blame for Double Shield pretty squarely on Orisa. This is understandable, and sort of in a vacuum, and Orisa is a worse hero design, like just straight up. Like, pull is a really silly thing to have in an FPS, where the inviolability of natural cover is a pretty nice thing to have. And she relies more on her shield. And Supercharger is also kind of an uninteractive ult, where it's absurdly strong, but it just feels uninteractive. There's nothing fun about it. You don't get to place something or do it smartly. you get to place something, but like you don't get to like do something smartly or feel good about managing to get as many people as you do. It also kind of lacks counterplay. You can like save an ult to counter it, but that might not work because it's a damage boost, so like even Trank might not beat it, and it's also important for at least a lot of things in the game to have counterplay after they get put down. And in a lot of situations, Supercharger, there is no counterplay after it gets put down besides to kite. Like, it's impossible to destroy it. Sometimes you can kill it, but sometimes you can't, especially in double shield, my god. Anyway, because Orisa was banned, because this comp exists as an alternative when Orisa is banned, you actually see this the most on King's Row in particular, which kind of gives us a clue about why exactly it would be run. On other maps, people mostly prefer, especially on attack, but really in general, Winston Zarya, or Winston Diva, or even Ball Zarya, Ball Diva, Ball Sig. Not to mention plenty of Rein Rush as well. This is a very big Rein Rush season in general. It would often even be Rein Rush, like Rein Sig, Bat Brig. Like, it would often be Rein Rush with no Lucio, which is kind of funny. But again, Brig was just really, really strong. And Rein Sig would rush, but also was okay with playing longer range. Because, I mean, Fire Strike is fine poke. And then, you know, Sigma and just the massive shielding afforded by Rein was still plenty to play a slower style. Ana was also banned on this patch, which is why you see teams either do Bat Brig or Zen Brig exclusively. Not this patch, this week or set of weeks. Ana was banned when Orisa was banned in this period, so again, that's why you see these backlines. And maybe another reason why Sigma is preferred, actually, is that if you had both two dive tanks, so to speak, it would be almost impossible for BAP to reasonably heal both of them. And your options are either, you know, have BAP try and land long-range heals on, like, a Diva and a Winston, or go Zen, which is fine. I mean, the Shock loved it and adapted just fine. They win this map, or this series too. But it's still low healing. Whereas you can kind of make it a Sigma, and then it's like, oh, I only have one tank diving, so my other tank is much easier for my BAP to heal. And another way I think this comp is more legible is to remember that Winston Zarya is not only a thing that was very good on this patch, but the mere existence of Double Bubble helps us interpret this comp, because you remember that it really is quite reasonable for a Winston to go alone, and then for the off tank to just be more stationary, you know, more anchored on the point, and more focused on providing this like durable backbone for your back line. And that's the other thing that makes this comp make more sense, is that, as we know now, Winston and Sigma are both some of the strongest tanks in Overwatch 2, at least overall and on paper. These are designs that fundamentally are pretty self-sufficient. They appreciate another tank, but they don't need it. And so one of the ways to understand this comp is that there really isn't synergy, but it's two tanks who can kind of do their own thing quite well, so it's okay. Again, Winston's not really going to single-handedly kill people with no helpers, but again, you know, he can take space, deny high ground, farm damage, and the Sigma can take some off angle more or less unassisted, enable his DPS, split people off with his shield, and Sigma even can, as he does sometimes, get in on the dive if it's like a Winston going, and the Sigma can walk up, put in some huge hyperspheres to get some good damage, use a shield to split someone off or protect the Winston a little bit, and so on. So this comp is not as dysfunctional as one might assume, especially from the perspective of late Overwatch 1 / Overwatch 2. But I think this really exposes how broken Sigma was for a while as well, and reminds us that Double Shield was Sigma's fault just as much, if not more, than Orisa's fault. This character was so strong. I mean, Release Sigma was one of the strongest characters ever put in any build of the game or in any FPS ever. I mean, it's not Release Brig strong, but Release Sigma was insane. And then, you know, you add, just think even a year down the line, he wasn't nerfed that strongly. He was nerfed, to be sure, but not that strongly.
Regardless of who is to blame for Double Shield, though, the meta returned to that after only 2 weeks, when the Orisa ban expired. What resulted was the Double Shield Ashe Genji meta that ended up giving 2 underdog franchises, Paris and NA and Guangzhou and APAC, their first and I think only tournament victories. Additionally, even while this comp existed, not every team bothered to play it. Some did. Florida and Boston in particular, as I showed you, really liked it. and others like the LA Gladiators and SF Shock would tolerate Winston Sigma when they felt obligated to play it. Others, though, found the entire idea of Winston and Sigma being played at the same time as ridiculous on its face and never bothered. This was the dominant mood in APAC for every team except the Seoul Dynasty, and even they were reluctant, and the Atlanta Reign thought similarly. Hawk was obviously not even bad at Sigma, but they seemed to subscribe to our more traditional view that we have in hindsight, that Winston and Sigma at the same time is just ridiculous. And so Atlanta preferred Rein Sigma Rush, as well as a wide range of Zarya-based comps, namely Double Bubble. Double Bubble and Ball Zarya were also the preferred modes in APAC. In general, D.Va was on the downswing at this time, probably because Genji was so overtuned and the synergy between him and Zarya is just too strong. Rein Sigma Rush was also mostly an NA thing, as we might imagine, stereotypically preferring Rush, even when the main tanks were Korean, as Rein Sigma was not really seen in APAC. Altogether, this meta was certainly a weird one, and we still never think of Winston Sigma as being a real tank combo in hindsight. However strong it was, Winston Sigma receded pretty quickly, and although it was short-lived, it was a pretty fun curiosity that shows us some interesting trends at a very unusual and brief period in the game's life. And although it still is not really remembered as a serious tank duo, I'm glad I could preserve it because it just sounded so funny to talk about, and I was able to actually really dig into the extent to which Winston Sigma existed, because I dimly remember that it happened, but not exactly when, why, or how common it was. So for our next weird tank duo, we will be returning to double main tank, but now we'll be looking at Orisa Rein. This duo, I said something about considering not even putting it on this list because it was too common, but I don't think that's actually that reasonable. I think this comp really was limited, except for this particular ban list, week 10 of 2020, which was D.Va banned, actually. D.Va was the only tank banned on this patch. This comp ended up being really strong. It still might not have been actual meta. I think it's very possible, if not likely, that if this patch existed longer, Orisa Sigma would really just take over as the meta comp. It would just be mostly double shield. And indeed, Orisa Sigma was still really strong on most other maps. I think Rein Sigma, or rather, Rein Orisa was preferred on maps where teams wanted to run Rush anyway. Because I think basically the main Rush tank comp at this time was Rein D.Va. So with D.Va banned, I think if teams really wanted to rush, they would just go Rein. I mean, they would just go Orisa, because Orisa does not provide the utility of Matrix, but she provides more poke than kind of any other comp. And Sigma provides comparable poke, but I imagine the orthodoxy around Sigma at this time was that he just wasn't a rush hero. I think Rein Sigma Rush, even though it was pretty good, just wasn't a thing people thought of at this time. I think it was probably just dismissed as a silly notion on its face without people actually trying to make sure that it's good or bad on its face. Because Sigma is admittedly kind of weak at close range. It's not as bad as people think, because his left click is still fine at close range if you just aim it at the floor or have some decent sig mechanics. But I imagine there was just an orthodoxy that he was a bad character in a rush comp, and again, it's understandable. And his left shift really would be invalidated, and his rock would be awkward or not really stun that long. I get it. That would end up being wrong. Rein Sig Rush would be really strong, but that would be a later development. I think a lot of it was also that there was just an arms race in terms of how do we get the most poke / how do we get the most shielding to prevent that poke. And so, the amount of poke just keeps ramping up with Hanzo Mei. And so the amount of shielding just ramps up to meet that. So now it's Rein Orisa, which is more raw shielding than Orisa Sigma. So there's probably an arms race element too, so to speak. In terms of the justice here, they're doing something very silly by having Corey on Widow. Obviously this is a Widow map, but that is profoundly unserious. Who on earth is he shooting in this comp, right? Because Genji has deflect and can dive and kill him. Doom maybe, but Doom is just going to be zipping around the map too fast to be caught and might have too much overhealth to be one shot and can also dive him. Corey's just a squishy target. And if not, Doom will be playing firmly inside of his team where he has 2 giant shields to protect him. Same goes for the supports. Okay, obviously they get one shot, but
in a comp like this, especially in Overwatch 1, but even in Overwatch 2, if you were to play Rein Rush with Bap Lucio, the way that Bap Lucio play is that they just play stacked on the Rein. They play as close to him as they really can be. So Widow is just never getting value. It's ridiculous. The fact that he stays on it this long is silly. He goes Tracer more for touch than anything, but he should have been off Widow after one fight, if at all. But this is the difficulty of having such short-lived ephemeral metas, is that people don't really understand some of the things because they just don't have enough time to test it all, or maybe their sample size is too small. I mean, that's one reason hero pools no longer exist, were never really tried like they were tried in 2020 again, for good reason. And the Fuels comp is interesting actually because it sees the state of affairs, this meta, and its solution is to just ignore that with cleave damage, with like close range damage and especially damage that just ignores shield melee damage. I remember one of the commentators, I think Wolf, characterized Genji as basically like a dash reset thing, and it's pretty accurate. Like the entire character is orbiting around, being able to just dash through the team over and over again as people get kills. So you see the vision there. I will continue onward to, wait, was it Hanamura? Yeah, Hanamura, because that was also actually a pretty interesting map with some insane things happening on Dallas's defense. We see a few interesting things here. For one, I really should have thought of this time period when I did my little segment on Junkrat in my first video. Maybe I'll do like a Junkrat episode or something. No promises, but like maybe. Or more Weird Heroes videos. Because Junkrat, you know, trying to just break the Rein Orisa shields or the double shield was a thing at this time. It was not just, you know, giving up and resorting to cleave the way they did in the 2019 playoffs meta with Doom Reaper. Another interesting thing, actually, speaking of, is that Reaper was banned on this patch, and I actually wonder if that was another reason Rein Orisa saw more play, is that, you know, the Orisa would not be getting exploded by Rein, and oh my god, Doha. I saw this. I didn't want to, like, cover this map originally, and then I like, turned it on just to see what was happening, and I saw Doha get a 5k with Riptire, and I was like, okay, we should include this. He dies, but obviously that's well worth the trouble. Oh my god, man. It's so funny. Also see something cool with Hanzo about the macro of this meta that I didn't really notice, or this matchup especially. And we'll get to it when we get to it, which is in like less than a minute. Yeah, so we see, of course, the obvious thing is that, you know, you could look at this and say, oh my god, it's Rein Orisa. And Rein Orisa was solid, but Double Shield was also a thing. It, you know, neither of the heroes were banned, and again, I think if this meta existed longer, it might have trended towards Double Shield because Double Shield was just such a strong comp. And we see here, Decay, he held when he could see everyone through the wall. Well, we as the viewer could see everyone through the wall. Decay didn't use his dragon, which was kind of surprising to me. But I realized that the reason he saved it is because the way the macro works in this comp is you save it for teleport. Because, you know, with a TP, they're all going to be funneled into this cooldown that's in a specific area. So you just dragon that, and you're either getting a kill or you're forcing cooldowns just for them to not die to the dragon. If you do it on time, that is. So that was another cool thing. But yeah. And you also see Symmetra, which makes perfect sense. Dallas used it on their attack too, because, you know, first of all, it's TP rush. It's always nice to just cut the distance so you don't get poked by using TP. But also, Symmetra already had the thing where she restores ammo on shields, I believe, so I think Sim didn't see as much use outside of map-specific situations because you were losing a lot on poke, and you were pretty useless until you got close to the opponent, even if getting close could be enabled by TP. But in situations, maps, and comps where she really could just get right on top of the opponent in one piece, she was really strong, because of course she was, because she would just have infinite high energy and infinite ammo too. And I actually didn't even watch far enough to see this. Justice go ball Winston with a Roar Ellie vote, which, you know, wow. Excellent ball mechanics on display from Ellie vote. That's why this guy got an hour contract. He deserved an hour contract to be sure. But the ball is not inspirational, to put it lightly. A lot of off-tank ball was used on these Diva Band lists, which is just a joyous grand old time. Decay, CS surfing on the roof there. Wonderful. Anyway, this Rein Orisa meta was a cool one, a funny one. In terms of why it isn't seen outside of this patch, I think the basic reason, there's a few. First of all, the most obvious thing that comes to mind, at least to me, is that in a vacuum, Rein Orisa is anti-synergy. They work against each other. Like, Orisa wants to be as far away from the opponent as possible, and Rein essentially wants to be as close to the opponent as possible. So when you run this comp, both tanks want something different. I think the way it squares the circle with that is that it's just a rush comp, but Orisa isn't actually that bad at close range. Because first of all, in a rush mirror, the question of trying to do more poke than the opponent is still important, and Orisa achieves that very well. Also, again, because of Fortify, Orisa doesn't actually die that easy in a close range engagement. She's not someone like Sigma who like wants you to be far away, and then when you get on top of her, she just auto loses. That is not something about her. She also has Supercharger, which is, as I mentioned previously, almost an auto fight win, or at the very least forces the enemy team to kite for like its entire duration. And especially with double shield, you're kind of never getting rid of Supercharger, barring trying to push into it, which is almost suicidal by nature. So it's also really nice. And again, you can never say no to Halt. Halt is just a wonderful, wonderful cooldown. So those are probably the reasons. But outside of this patch, I think it wasn't really used that much, mainly because when you did run Rush, D.Va was mostly better. The utility she provided, the amount of people who were really familiar with D.Va, and so on. D.Va has mobility that no other tank in the game has. I think that's another key to sort of understanding this, is that D.Va is mobile. You know, you try to play high ground to deal with her, she can actually contest that, whereas all these other tanks kind of can't. And that's probably another reason Orisa was used, is that once you've accepted that no rush comp can contest high ground, that it's just completely impossible to contest high ground with anything, then I think the Orisa is nice, because it's just like, okay, well, we're never contesting high ground, so it's purely about like a flat engagement, and at that point, you just want as much shielding and as much damage as possible, and Rein Orisa just min-maxes that, basically. But it's a very strange comp, and again, this was pretty short-lived. This ban list was 1 week long, and afterwards people returned to a lot of different stuff. Mostly Rein D.Va Rush, but Winston Rush and Winston 6-man began to return. Ball Sig saw some use, Ball 6-man started to see some use. Rein Zarya probably was used, I'm not saying probably, I know this, on maps where high ground wasn't really an issue, etc. That's the other thing, probably. Actually, this is a minor thing, but if Rush is foreclosing the possibility of contesting high ground, Zarya is probably like a good first idea, because, you know, it's Zarya. She's gonna have high energy, she can just melt through everything. But I imagine maybe, and this is just a guess, like the first scrim meta for it, like when this ban list was first announced, was like Rein Zarya, and then someone had the bright idea to just replace the Zarya with an Orisa so that you could just have more shielding to prevent the Zarya from doing anything. And then it worked, and the people were like, oh, well, we should just always play this comp, because the final form of this meta is just a mirror of that. He also had novel roster solutions to this, as we see, where if teams were absolutely certain that they should be playing Rein Orisa, they would just play double main tank. Orisa, not really known for her skill cap, but some teams still did not trust their off tanks' ability to play Orisa. Others, either because they wanted the possibility of the off tank playing an off tank hero open, or because they didn't really care if their off tank just played Orisa on map, didn't make the swap. But Shock does Super Smurf here, and we saw the Fuel do Trill Gamsu for map 1, and then they sub Gamsu out to get Note back for when they want to play Sigma again. But yeah, this is a very funny meta. Not long-lived, not popular, bizarre to watch, and endlessly funny. Next, returning to the 2020 Hog meta, we will now be looking at D.Va Hog. Originally, I reserved this comp, which I had only seen in this Seoul Shanghai VOD, for the end of the video. I assumed that it was a one-off that was never used anywhere else, because one, for the most obvious reason, this comp is pretty bad. In fact, even though it really was used a bit, I still think it's quite bad, hence why it never became hard meta. And because I didn't remember it being used anywhere else. So I assumed that it was only used by Seoul as this transient, short-lived counterpick and never chosen again. And so I decided, oh, well, this is a one-off thing rather than an actual composition, so I don't really need to explain it, or there isn't enough context for me to really understand why the hell it was chosen, so I'm just going to give up and not talk about it, or I'm just going to like pair it with some broad thoughts about the video. We're still going to do that. I'm still going to use a one-off comp to finish the video, but Not right now. Or rather, this isn't that comp. This Hog Diva comp is yet another bizarre comp from the 2020 playoffs. Soul mostly used it here, and it was mostly pretty bad. In fact, Marvel would regularly waffle back and forth between Diva and Ball, both in the previous map and in this map. Kings. After Kings, which I believe Shanghai would end up winning in extra innings, Seoul would finally realize that Hog Sig was more the best comp they had and start using that, and so they'd, either intentionally or accidentally return to what the real meta was. Nice barrage profit. Anyway, whereas I originally thought this comp was only used by Soul, I actually saw in a punk frag movie from another creator. I forget his name. I'll link the video in the description because I know how to find the video. Another creator who started making owl frag movies of players' careers. He made one on punk, and one of the clips is from Houston versus Boston in the 2020 play-ins. And that map, and almost the entire series, in fact, was actually a Hog Diva mirror. So thanks to happening to see that video, I had to re-record the section and account that Hog Diva actually was used a decent amount in the post-roll lock era. Still not good, even on this patch, and I'll get into why, but at least it was used. In terms of the reasons this comp was used, first of all, I'm not exactly sure. My best guess, I think, especially against Soul, this kind of clues me in. As I mentioned in my previous discussion of this Hog meta, the other comp that people thought was either better or almost as good was the thing Shanghai's on here, which is this Winston 6-man with Lucio Moya, Tracer, Winston Diva, and either Reaper or Tracer, normally Reaper. And the way this comp worked, or one of the ways it worked, was that it could just hack the Hog and then run him over. It could choose other targets, but it could just hack the Hog, and in theory, if this comp is executed well enough, Hog comp doesn't really do anything, because you can't really hook someone and meaningfully punish them enough to kill them. I think the Diva is a nice counter to this comp, though, because for the same reasons, basically, the Diva is still used today as a counter swap to a Winston dive, both in Overwatch 1 and 2, where you realize that because they're on dive, they have to dive you and get close to you, and in that situation, you might as well just go Diva, because not only does the Matrix help with survivability, but more importantly, she can just kind of shred them with her micro missiles and Matrix. And I think that's why Marvel does it. However, Marvel also likes to go back to Ball for seemingly random reasons. I think it's just when he feels like the Diva is too squishy. Because that's honestly the main problem with Diva. It's a weird thing to say about her, but she is far too squishy in this composition. That's really the problem. Because when you have a Hog, as I mentioned, Hog really likes to be in a pokey comp that goes slower, sort of projects space, that's why he does the best with Sigma and Orisa. Hog already creates space in the entire range of his hook purely by intimidation. You're afraid of getting hooked, so you can't even basically walk in my direction until that cooldown's been used. Or unless you have a shield or something to protect you. Once you pair that with a Sigma or Orisa, you can either double up on an angle, which is completely unassailable, or you can have the Sigma take one angle and the Hog take another, and now you're projecting a huge amount of map control. Because there's one angle that the Sigma's got shut down with his shield and his left click, and there's one that Hog has got shut down by pure aura. Not really aura, but However, the Diva is a little counterintuitive because she doesn't project power. She has to kind of get close to you to really make you scared. The other reason, as we'll probably see, that this comp is flawed is that Diva is still very squishy in this comp. She can do the various tasks that make Diva a useful and pretty universally splashable off-tank. She can mess with high ground, she can peel for her supports, she can dive someone either with her other tank, not an option here, but in general she can, or with a DPS. In fact, that's a common thing that happens in these Hog Diva comps in NA. The Diva would kind of dive in collaboration with a Tracer, or Sombra, or Pharah. Pharah was also really popular in this meta. First of all, she synergizes with Hog's approach, Hog's shared approach, where Hog wants a fight to just go long and slow, so that he gets more opportunities to hook, or his team playing spread out and on angles gradually bleeds out the resources. Pharah is really good in long fights. Over time, the sheer amount of damage she does just you know, she could like charge a barrage in one fight or just do so much splash damage that resources gradually get bled out. Whereas Farah isn't fast and survivable enough, and mobile enough to really just like do like a really quick, clean dive. Not unless she has nano. She really gets set up and finds a juicy target. It's pretty rare. And the D.Va, because she has no other tank to help, and also one of her supports might be permanently glued to either a Pharah or an Ashe that's playing on like the other side of the map, is often just not going to have enough healing. And also, Hog hooking the D.Va still isn't bad. She might live because she has Matrix, but Hog can hook D.Va really out of position. And keep in mind, this is an Overwatch 1 tank, not an Overwatch 2 tank, so you're a lot squishier, and positioning actually matters a bit more than it does in Overwatch 2, where at least if you're the tank, like positioning obviously matters, but sometimes you just have so much HP and damage reduction that you kind of can't die, or like minor mistakes just aren't a big deal. Like getting hooked as a tank in Overwatch 2 isn't like that big of a deal unless they combo every cooldown in the game with it, and even then only some characters are susceptible. But in Overwatch 2, like you hook a D in Overwatch 1, you hook a D.Va, she might die. So D.Va is actually pretty squishy. In terms of why this comp is played, I don't really understand. Far as I can tell, at least in the Boston versus Houston case, it was kind of like a as like Unter and the Uncoachable people say, a handshake, where both teams have just decided that they want to mirror it, and they're confident that they can win the mirror. Also, the meta was young and underdeveloped, obviously, so it's possible that no one even knew what the right comp was, so anything that kind of felt right on match day or clicked with your own hero pools, because Mecha was like almost a D.Va one-trick. Punk actually had a good Sigma on him as well as a good D.Va, so Punk makes a little less sense, but I think he still preferred D.Va maybe, and I don't know. It's just odd. But on maps like these, it makes more sense because at least D.Va is doing a lot of high ground contesting, but Houston and Boston played this almost everywhere in the series. It's kind of bizarre. The other reason is the thing I mentioned with that Seoul did, where when the other idea about what's meta is this Winston 6-man, D.Va is okay. She's still not amazing, and I think you'd rather have a Zarya, but she at least like does her job and has a clear-cut like justification where she can shred and make it hard for the Winston and Sombra to do their job. Sombra in particular is actually another good excuse for D.Va because she's the best spy checking hero in the game with her infinite ammo and massive shotguns. So in any downtime, she can make it actually somewhat reasonable to just deal with the Sombra, at least in theory. However, Zarya still seems better because, first of all, Zarya allows the Hog Zarya allows you to go all in on a specific concept. Like, you at least get to max out one stat bar, so to speak, of your comp, which is like close to mid-range damage. Like, you have infinite close to mid-range damage. People have to be scared of you purely because of the sheer terror you can inflict in them and just how much you can shred anything if it gets close enough to you. Second, Matrix usually, or isn't always enough to actually save Hog, especially when Ana was the preferred flex support of almost every team, except for the ones that really wanted to force Zenyatta. So you could anti a Hog, and Matrix wasn't always saving him, because it's like a limited resource and it's only protecting him from one side, and maybe they'll have some sort of damage that can kind of go through it. It doesn't really work. There's a moment later in the series, actually, where exactly that happens, where I think like Fusions gets antied, and Punk is trying his darndest to hold his Matrix on him, but it just doesn't matter. Like, you just die. Zarya, on the other hand, is way better for this, because she doesn't have to play proactively at all. She can just bubble the Hog after she sees him take a negative side effect or get low. And also what the Justice in particular would do is just bubble the Hog when he peeks, so that you don't get stunned out of doing it, and because it's a pretty free way to get energy usually, because they can't like react to a Hog jumping out of cover in time to like say, oh, well, we can shoot that. They're just gonna shoot. Still, but again, I must stress, this was a flawed comp and not that popular. And as it turned out, like I said, not only did Sigma end up being the actual meta, but if you really didn't like the Sigma comp, Zarya got far more mileage on most maps. And Zarya was even better into this Winston 6-man that some teams are playing, since you could just cut through Matrix entirely, and it was pretty easy to get a bunch of energy. So with that, we have Hog D.Va accounted for. A weird comp, a funny comp, and one that really shouldn't have been used as much as it was. But when you have an unformed meta, things like this will happen. You know, people haven't cracked or discovered the full thing yet. I think one of the reasons Sigma is strong is because he's strong specifically in like a mirror of Hog. Like, if you're having like a mirror of Hog Zarya or something, you're gonna pick Sigma over Zarya because it's just more poke, and like Sigma is just better against this Hog Zarya and Hog Diva stuff, even if he might be a little worse against the Winston 6-man comp, because he would be. That's another thing about metas that people underestimate, is that a lot of times when metas develop, some of the heroes that will be in it will actually develop not because they're like the best in every matchup, but because they're best in the kind of mirror that's going to end up happening. Another good example of this I can think of is Zen in Goats, where Zen originally wasn't actually the flex supporting Goats because people thought that like you needed the extra healing of Moira, or you wanted the group healing, or when matched up into other stuff that tried to counter it, like ball DPS comps or whatever, Moira was more survivable and the more healing actually mattered. But once everyone was playing Goats, then Zen was really good because you got an extra support ult, defensive ult rather. You did a lot of poke, and you had Discord, which, when used properly, could absolutely shred the enemy's 3 tanks, because they also had 3 tanks. But again, like, before it really came down to go to mirrors, Zen wasn't used that much. And part of that was just people not understanding how strong Zen was, but a lot of it, again, is that you really needed to wait until mirrors were standard practice for Zen to really get used. So I think Sigma in this comp might have been another case of that. In any case, like I said, that accounts for Hog Diva, which I originally overlooked, but I didn't give it its due and didn't realize just how common it really was. Finally, for our conclusion, I'd like to look at probably the most insane tank lineup I've seen in this entire video. I didn't discover this comp until just today, the day I'm recording it. This is absolutely ridiculous, and it's such a complete one-off that I actually figured it would be better for my conclusion, because it's actually impossible to really get a grip on why the hell it would be used, or like its real applications, or why it fell out of fashion, or anything like that, because it was used in one case and never any other. And that would be the Toronto Defiance Rein Hog. Rein Hog is one of those tank duos that is so bad in 222 that, again, I assumed it hadn't really been used at all. It doesn't make any sense. It's fundamentally dysfunctional. Rein absolutely needs some sort of off tank to kind of beef him up, cleanse him of negative effects, and also there are just off tanks that can get more out of being paired with him. Sigma allows a rush to play kind of slow and pokey but still get value. Diva is the standard pick that it gives the comp some sort of high ground, a bunch of extra utility, and can protect the Rein proactively from all kinds of stuff. And Zarya allows you to reactively help Rein, gives you the most raw front-loaded damage at the expense of basically not being able to contest high ground without just walking there the slow way. But again, the raw damage and comfort is appreciated. Hog, however, doesn't do anything. It's just Hog. And as I mentioned in the previous segment, if you must run Hog, and Hog was meta at this time, so you probably should, he wants a poke comp. He doesn't really want to get close to you. If he gets close to you, he's just going to blow up, basically. I mean, he has a shotgun, but he wants to bring people to him. He doesn't want to be in a rush. Not in 222 anyway. Obviously, Hog and Sigma were fine in tank comps, like quad tank or triple tank, but he would be in a comp where he still had a Zarya or a Diva to help him out, and the entire point was just the pure HP pool that made him good if you could force point and have a giant shield protecting you. In this situation, he's pretty much useless. Indeed, even as Toronto play this, and Sideshow mentioned this in the commentary as I was watching, Toronto doesn't even really play it like Rush. They just kind of play it like Poke, where the Rein is shielding most of the time and forcing point, which isn't that bad. Like Rein is pretty good at forcing point. That's one of the main things he does, because he's just so much HP, and then you have to fight into his massive hammer. But if you're just forcing point like that, especially at this time in the game's life, why not just go Orisa? You still get a bunch of shielding, and you actually get way more utility that combos with Hog. It's bizarre. Even the way Toronto was playing, you'd really think they'd just go Orisa, but somehow they didn't. As best I can tell, the idea of the comp is that you force point with your shield, and then because you have a hammer, it's like better than having Orisa. And this point in particular was kind of conducive to this close range rush, as long as the enemy wasn't on Widow, and this was a good Widow map, or on a Flyer, and this was a good Flyer map. However, the Glads, as Toronto, I guess, knew, they probably scouted that or something, it wasn't on either of those things. Still, again, complete lack of utility to like help the Rein get anything done makes the comp a bad gimmick that doesn't work. And so this tank duo was never seen again, and Toronto got absolutely stomped on this submap. With this, there isn't really any defending it. There isn't really any rationalizing. It's just a terrible idea. But with that, with a comp that isn't justifiable, isn't explicable, is just poor, and therefore there's kind of less to chew on, I'm going to reach my conclusion. The main reason I made this video was not to have any sort of major persuasive argument like I did in my support duos video, or really my main support flex support divide video. Rather, I just wanted to make a video because this was a topic I thought of that people seemed to want, and it was a fun window into looking at some of the more interesting moments in OWL history, especially during the hero pools era, and especially the 2020 playoffs meta, because so many Roadhog metas were just, or so many, the elevation of Roadhog to hard meta status created all kinds of comps that we never saw before or since. So, in a sense, this video is almost like a 2020 playoffs meta retrospective, though there's more to it than that. And even if it was, there's nothing wrong with that. Still, we saw plenty of other metas too, you know, Winston Sigma, Winston Ball, and the brief clip of Orisa Zarya. Again, a one-off that there's little to actually talk about because it was such an aberration that we really could appreciate throughout this video. With that, I guess if anything about improving at the game can be taken away from this video, I think these kinds of metas are a good reminder. First of all, that at every level below, like, I don't know, tier 3 or something, meta is pretty fake if you're good enough, and people are so bad at the game in so many elements, because, like, whatever, they're diamond players, or, like, you know, tier 4 players or whatever, that you can force heroes just all the time if you're good enough. And again, it's not hard to be good enough, because people have so many different elements of their game that they can improve on, that if you just have that little benefit from experience or rote playtime, that actually matters. Moreover, and sort of related to that, we see that even heroes that traditionally aren't considered to have much or any synergy still can synergize given the right situation. Fundamentally, characters in Overwatch just have kits that are deep enough and can be experimented with enough that even characters that don't traditionally go together, so to speak, can still synchronize cooldowns or use their tools to help each other, even if we don't normally think of them going together. And in general, it gives the lie to a certain extent to orthodoxy and our conceptions of what has to be good or what is always good. It challenges us to think about seeing a comp like this and talking about a comp like this, challenges us to justify comps and ways of playing the game not purely on it's what everybody does, or it's what I'm used to, or it's what I see all the time, but to actually think about why they work together. Not this is good because of course it's good, everyone says it's good. Not this is good because it just is, but you know, this is good because these characters can do this together. This is good in spite of its weird reputation because it actually played to this team's strengths, or it was good at this particular moment in the game's history, or one hero was unavailable for picking, etc. And that's the last interesting thing that we see from this. A lot of times meta compositions, what the best comp on a map or in a period of the game's life is, aren't actually like the fault of everyone involved. A lot of times when something has been meta for a lot, you see in the community people start to blame like every element of the comp. Like, oh my god, Mauga's meta. It's like Mauga's fault, but also it's Juno's fault, but also it's Frigg's fault, but also it's Perks' fault, but also it's Sojourn's fault, but also it's Reaper's fault. Like, no. Like, you could just ban one hero and then an entire comp becomes unplayable or incredibly difficult to use. You could ban one hero and something that was normally considered completely useless suddenly becomes a solid pick. ban Orisa, right? And then the House of Cards ends up falling that Winston Sigma, of all things, is meta, even though Winston Diva is choosable, even though Winston Zarya is choosable. So, if nothing else, I hope, most importantly, I hope you guys enjoyed its retrospective. I hope you liked what I had to say. And again, if you have anything to add that I forgot or overlooked, please let me know, because I'm happy to respond. I think it would be cool. And I hope that at least gives you some food for thought about how we think about the game, the way you choose heroes, how you justify things, and encourages you to actually use your brain a bit in explaining why pros pick the compositions they do, or why you pick the compositions you do, and to not be afraid of one-tricking or of keeping your hero pool small. Because yes, you can counterpick, and yes, you can always have the perfect support duo that a pro would choose, but the pros don't even always do that. And again, the characters in the game have such fundamentally deep kits that can be interpreted and reused in so many different ways that you can think outside the box and just make one character work a lot if you really want to. If you want to know why one tricks can, get rank 1 or get top 10 or whatever, this is why, because there's really a lot to chew on, and we shouldn't assume that everything in this game has already been figured out, even in the big 2025. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.